I think we're good to go here, guys. First of all, thank you so much for coming. This is the official opening of the Whistleblower. I'm Eoghan McNeill from The Ditch, and we're part of this opening, we'll say. We've got a nice day of talks and a bit of food and drink downstairs, so please make good use of it all. For the first chat we're going to have today is it's going to be about media and alternative media, left media. Big kind of a broad chat, like sometimes at The Ditch we like to talk about, okay, why are we doing this, and that can be about individual stories, but also about the broader project and this idea of building an alternative to mainstream media that also sometimes straddles mainstream a little bit, and that sort of interplay, and also what it means to be a left alternative and how we can support the left and what the left should look for in its alternative media. We've got a great panel joining us here with a real diverse mix of people whose career straddle both the mainstream and the alternative media, and broadly speaking, all coming from a left tradition. And we've got Oisín Gilmore, who is an economist at Task. He's also a founding editor of Eoghan, which is a Republican magazine. You should all subscribe to it. It's great. We've got Rowan, who is an academic, a journalist, an activist, someone who's very much involved in the movement for Irish neutrality and independence and sovereignty, who also writes for the Irish Times and the Irish Examiner. We've got Aoife Moore, who is an award-winning journalist. I think the most recent one was for Columnist of the Year for her work with the Irish News. She also has written for the Examiner, for which she won Journalist of the Year for her work on the story about Golfgate, and now she has a podcast called The Gaggle. And we've got Jenny Maguire, who also has real good, strong experience in left-wing activism, was involved with the pro-Palestine movement back in Trinity College, that won some amazing concessions from the college over the last couple of years, and now writes for the Irish Independent and is a commentator, where you can see her on the likes of Virgin Media, where back in the presidential election campaign, she was one of the most visible and prominent voices, who is obviously pro-Catherine Connolly, kind of kicking against the tide a little bit, which is a little bit of a theme of what we're going to be talking about here today. So we're going to start off here. I'm going to go to Rory first, and I'd like to get... You're someone who writes some amazing columns in both the Irish Times and the Irish Examiner. I always think of the column that you had in the Irish Times about neutrality and how we should stop deriding it. Again, kicking against the tide and the dominant narratives around these issues. And what I'd like to ask you is, could you give us a broad critique of the mainstream media, the politics of it,
3 minutes.
Yeah.
the ideology of it, what we're all working with here, and what it's like being a dissenting voice within it?
Sure. Thanks for having us here, Eoghan, and thanks for everyone coming on this sweaty day. That's a very handy question, because it actually is the first page of my notes. And it allows me to get to the big point that I wanted to make first. And that is that, I'll talk about kind of individual journalists, publications, and so on, and the kind of networks that exist there. But I do think it's important. It's not just about individuals, not just about specific publications and the networks between those and that kind of, revolving door that exists there. But we need to understand the kind of structural kind of position in which that happens. And I think that's basically where my analysis would be of the role of the mainstream media, whether we're thinking about the big publications like the Irish Times, Independent, Examiner, and RTE, and the kind of nexus between them as a kind of like a comprador, really. And what I mean by that is in the sense that, taken from Marxist kind of dependency theory, yes, you're getting that in the first question, that the comprador is the kind of in the imperial system, the kind of, let's say, the local or national elite or establishment who do the work of maintaining imperial relations within the kind of the dominated or the semi-peripheral country. So in the case of Ireland, that all sounds very theoretical. In the case of Ireland, the role of the media is essentially to maintain the status quo. And the status quo internally and domestically is about kind of, I guess, maintaining the kind of rentier system. And we can see that in debates about housing and so on. And internationally, it's about maintaining Ireland's position economically as a kind of dependency within the Irish, within the kind of imperial system led by the US. And, so maintaining the status quo doesn't just look like resisting all change. Sometimes it means pushing change. And I think what we're seeing with the debate about neutrality, which is the kind of my main area of working, is that there's an establishment consensus that Ireland needs to get rid of neutrality, join in the kind of militarization project at the EU level, kind of protect the interests of NATO, the British state, the European Union, because the United States, let's say, imperial priorities have shifted away from Europe towards trying to contain China. And in the logic of this imperial system, Europe has to pay up, right? And we're being told we have to pay up too. And so what we're seeing is across all those kind of mainstream papers, taking the line of the government, taking the line of the European Union. And I have this example which came up during the week. So where was it? Sorry, that's the wrong note. It was in March. Yes, March 19th, very specific. I was at an event in the EU Commission. They have a building around the corner of the EU Parliament, and it's basically a propaganda unit for the European Union. I don't think that's like being, conspiratorial. That's literally what its purpose is to promote the EU. And they run all sorts of kind of public events and with EU officials and so on. So they had an event on March 19th, and I'll finish in this because it don't take too long, called Neutrality in a Changing Europe, Ireland and Austria. And who they had was Conor Gallagher, who's the crime and security correspondent for the Irish Times, who's someone who published a book about 4 years ago called Is Ireland Neutral? And you can tell even in that, the title of that book, he's opening up this debate. And Conor Gallagher, surprisingly in that context, was very, very explicit about how he thought neutrality was a shameful thing, immoral, and Ireland should get rid of it. He never expresses that so clearly in his columns, but that's the way they're shaped. And then they had a guest from Austria who was called Professor Martin Sem, who is a professor of political science at the University of Innsbruck. So good, not just journalists, academics here at Clout. And it was moderated by Dervla MacDonald, right? So that happens in the EU Commission. There's an Irish Times journalist there, there's Dervla MacDonald, who's kind of independent journalist there, and they're all talking about we need to get rid of neutrality, what's the situation in Austria, what's the situation in Ireland. Now the amazing thing is that in July the 17th, in the Galway International Arts Festival, Professor Martin Sims, Conor Gallagher, Dervla MacDonald are taking part in another panel on the same topic. They've added another Irish Times journalist, Laura Marlowe, prominent advocate of EU militarization, fighting and extending the war in Ukraine. So 2 Irish Times journalists, Dervla MacDonald, the professor from Austria again, and this time it's called Neutrality, a Rational Conversation. Right? And I think that's really telling, not just this kind of loop between government... Sensible and serious.
Yeah.
And, and I know like you guys in the ditch have, that piece that Polly had some months ago now about like serious guys, and I think we can talk about serious guys in lots of areas, but what we're saying, and to just end that point about what it's like being a dissenting voice, you're constantly told, we're all constantly told, that we are immature, immoral, irresponsible, deluded, nostalgic, all these things to diminish and dismiss. So even when you get into publications, like the people here who are writing in mainstream publications, the context has been that you are like, we have to tolerate these people and bring them in, and they're kind of idiotic. But we'll do that to display the openness of the media. Right?
Yeah.
And I think we shouldn't underestimate, we don't have a totally closed media or anything like that. We do have some degree of openness, and we should be extending that, not dismissing it totally. But the constraints that are put on your voice by the context is that you are basically, either an idiot, a conspiracist, or a Putin supporter or whatever in that case. And we can look at other debates, whether it's Palestine, housing, healthcare, trans healthcare, where the broad conversation, there maybe is a voice brought in, but you're diminished and ridiculed already before you arrive. And I think that's really important to, as someone who occasionally gets into like the Examiner, the Irish Times, you're saying, they never let us in. And then the worry is like, fuck, they let us in now. Now we can't say that. But it's important to see those instances in the broader context and the tone with which you are, and just to say this, the last thing, myself and 2 colleagues, Patrick Bresnan and Patrick Brody, wrote a piece recently in the Examiner about an academic piece that we had. We're kind of like writing a more popular form as an op-ed, and it was about the relationship between militarization and Ireland's foreign direct investment economy. They stalled on it for about 2 weeks, and then they called it like military spending part 1. Sorry, part 2. And military spending part 1, which we didn't know was coming, was the two think tank workers from the IIEA, the pro-European think tank, who just brought out a report talking about the business case for Ireland's militarisation. They had military spending. We weren't told we were going to be set next to them. We submitted our article. They invited them to basically respond to it, but didn't tell us. And so that's an example of that tone setting and the kind of policing.
And you're playing away games, I suppose, as well, when you are publishing in these places. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But to turn to you, Aoife, obviously you still have a career in the mainstream, also in alternative media. Rory's talked a little bit about the currents and the ideologies that you're kicking against when you're publishing in mainstream media. But can you tell us a little bit about having set up the Gaggle and a podcast about
left-wing feminism
and pop culture, and tackling issues like the manosphere, like online treatment of people like Sydney Sweeney and Bonnie Blue and stuff? You're obviously kicking against other currents and other ideologies, and what have you taken from the mainstream at learning to address those, and how do you deal with? I mean, I suppose we're talking about social media here in a big way, and what are the dominant narratives and ideologies that you have to push up against?
Yeah, I would just even say to Rory's point, talking about even neutrality and the kind of the way it's been set up. When I went onto the Dáil 7 or 8 years ago, I'm so glad it is quite different now, but when I went into the Dáil, like, nobody knew what to do with me. Like, they couldn't believe that I would be, this very proud to be Northern nationalist journalist, and very my name's Aoife Grace Moore, so there's no guessing what community I come from. But I was always very open about, who my family are. My uncle murdered a bloody Sunday, family founded the campaign and whatever else. So that made, obviously then, because the type of people who were in the Dáil, then I became this caricature, this like shinner journalist, and that followed me around, since until I wrote the book. And that type of thing. Now I have to say, I worked for the Examiner. I loved my time there. They were very supportive of me, and what I really appreciated about Danny McConnell when he hired me was, like, Danny was a privately educated South Dublin man, but hired me because he knew I was the complete opposite of him. And political teams, I think, only get better when everybody looks different in the team. And the Examiner, I think, does a lot of that. But it's even in that conversation about military neutrality, I was phoned to go on a radio debate. And they said, we've got whoever it was, some ex-British general or whatever, he's going to be the for, and could you come on and be the against? And I said, I'm not the against. The Irish people are the against. Every single poll says that the Irish public do not want to join NATO. We do not want to give up neutrality. And then when I went on the show to say every point they made, I was like, but the Irish people don't want it. But the Irish people don't want it. But the Irish people don't want it. And it was like I was being treated like I was the idiot. It was like, even though this British general who, like, first of all, remember the last time we let the Brits decide what they were doing here? But like, this British general and the presenter were talking down to me as if I was the idiot because I was representing what every single poll tells us. This notion that you're, and you see it all the time when the people are talking about the left, this condescension, like, or this arrogance that sometimes they have that you just don't understand. And you see a lot of it when they're talking about housing policy or health for the children. It's like, you just don't understand. Well, what I understand is if I had a project that went X billion over and like X over a timeline, I'd be sacked. But in politics, you don't face consequences for those types of actions. And I find, like, I've done a bit of both, and like I've worked with BBC, and like I've done work for RT, and like I really believe in public sector broadcasting. And when you see like RT investigates and the amazing stuff they do, but then that's juxtaposed to their coverage of Gaza. And I really worry about RTE, because as much as I love it, I can completely understand people saying, here, I'm not watching that anymore. Because the way they frame certain debates, and not to quote the socialist theorist of our time, Gary Lineker, but they chose a side in Russia and Ukraine, so they can choose these sides. And when it comes to military neutrality, the debate, they've already settled it. You know, they've already said, and when Catherine Connolly was running for president, they made out that she was a lunatic, that she was a Russian spy, that she was this, that, and the other, and she won in a landslide. So despite all their condescension, they're still not winning. They're still not getting us. They're still not getting the people where they are. So I think like doing things like I've done the gaggle because like who doesn't want to talk about Bonnie Believe Your Two Mates, and make money out of it. But it was just that kind of notion of like, and I really lament that there isn't a proper, you know, political podcast in Ireland that I want, not to be hateful, but that I want to listen to. I mean, I listen to podcasts about American politics every day of the week, but the outlets here in Ireland aren't really aimed towards me. I mean, a renter, you know, working freelance, like I'm nowhere near, you know, say buying a house or whatever it is, and all of that is kind of geared towards their audience, but I find it very short-sighted because that audience, all the people who can't afford to buy houses are the people who are the audience who they need in the next 20 years. And I just feel like more and more people are going out on their own, or they're turning to other alternatives like the Dutch or whatever. But even I've noticed, you know, places like District are doing great on the ground reporting for young people, because the mainstream media has been geared towards the homeowners and landlords and the politicians. And like a lot of the times I think when you see the reporting on say RT or whatever it is, they're only reporting it because they want the politicians to know that they said it. Yeah. And I think if the genocide in Gaza has really undermined RT's message, and I would really, really hope that they do something to turn the tide, because it then demeans the amazing work that's done by RT Investigates and Doc on One and all those. But I very much fear, I think the cat's out of the bag now. I don't think they can come back from it.
Right. Yeah, and Oisín, given all these issues and the state of the Irish media industry and who it serves, obviously with An Clogan, it's an obviously left-wing publication. It has, you know, it's quite old school in a way. You know, it's it features weighty, serious opinion and reportage in a real like weighty product. You know, like something that we're kind of told that people don't have the attention spans for anymore. And throughout the publication, you know, I know I think it was in the first issue where you had a piece written by Claire Daly, you had an interview with Gerry Adams, you had a piece written by Cian O'Callaghan, so like broad left politics, but also dissenting voices, I suppose, like certainly in the case of Claire Daly and Gerry Adams. How do you set about setting the politics of An Clogan and identifying how to serve the people who are reading your magazine?
Yeah, so I suppose, for us the key thing is a sense that there's a real lack of space in the Irish media at the moment for the perspectives that we would broadly hold, which are socialist, Republican perspectives, and that this very much contrasts with where Ireland is. So, you know, if you think, I co-edited a book with David Landy, which was up there, which is about the development of the left between 2008 and 2018. And one of the things that we tried to show in it is, you know, that Ireland has really changed. You go back to 2007, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael are getting 75+% of the vote. You go back prior to that, and Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are getting, you know, 90%, 80%, very consistently, more or less all the way back to the foundation of the state with, you know, two exemptions. And today that's finished. And the reason that it's finished is because in Ireland there's a very strong left in Sinn Féin, Soc Dems, Labour, PPP. And this is completely, like remarkably absent from the Irish media landscape. There's really nobody, you know, whatever you might think about Sinn Féin, but there's almost nobody in the Irish media who is pro-Sinn Féin. There's loads of journalists that you go, oh, I'd say they're Soc Dem, they're probably Green, loads of them that are Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil. I can't think of anyone. You know, Aoife
think
Grace
you used to
Moore.
get
No, I
accused
don't
of
think.
it.
Yeah, she got accused of it a lot, but I don't think. I don't think. I don't think that's true. But that was,
Yeah.
there's really nothing, and that's a remarkable situation that there's nobody in the media that is sympathetic to the leading opposition party. That's a remarkable thing.
We get accused of being pro Sinn
Yeah.
Féin, but like we're actually worse than that. You know, like, but I think like anyone who kind of is even, you know, somewhat soft or fair on Sinn Féin is just considered. I
And
know
I
that
think
you got it.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I would say there was a journalist that I worked with for years who is an actual Shinner. And I used to be like, why am I getting all the grief when you're an actual Shinner? But I would say the thing is with the Shinner thing and whatever else, Saoirse McHugh was running for the Green Party and was being called a Shinner.
Yeah.
So like, if you are in any way left wing or you go against the grain, they think calling someone a Shinner is the worst possible thing that you can say, because once you call someone a Shinner, you don't have to listen to them anymore. You don't have to listen to their points. I went on the Tonight Show once and read out points that Bernardo's, the poverty charity, made about the budget, and they were like typical Shinner talking points from Bernardo's.
Yeah.
But I think as well, like even beyond, it's not the Sinn Féin point, but also, that today, not only in Ireland, it's beginning to change in other countries, but there has been a complete closure of political discussion to a socialist perspective, to the idea that we should have a socialist economy. It's really, really, forbidden, and we do have the situation where, the top 10% in Ireland own 50% of the wealth, the bottom 50% own 10%. And when we talk about the wealth distribution, this is like wealth in general, what really matters is financial wealth. And this is much more unequally distributed, with the tiny minority at the top of our society own everything that we use to produce the things we need to live. And that's the situation we're in. Now, in socialist theory, these are referred to as the capitalist class, they're referred to as the ruling class, and there's an idea that we shouldn't have a ruling class. We just shouldn't have one at all. Instead, we should have a democratic society where we don't have a minority that controls the means of production and is able to dictate what happens in our society. Now, this isn't a strange idea. This is a very old idea. It's an idea that was held by James Connolly. It was an idea that was held by most people in Clonmel Publicta. It was held by everybody who was involved in setting up the Labour Party. It was an idea that you find in the 1916 proclamation, you find it in Pearse, you find it in the Democratic Programme, you find it in the 1867 Fenian Programme, you find it everywhere, but you won't find it at all in the Irish media, and you won't hear it discussed ever, absolutely ever. And that's a very strange situation to be in. So, small little magazine, show it. Please try and get a copy. Please subscribe. But small magazine. But the idea is that we need a space. The left in Ireland is very divided, very, for lots of good reasons for that. But we need a space where those of us who are socialist, who are Republican, have a space where we can go, these are our ideas, these are not our ideas, these are blah, blah, blah. And in terms of, to, I suppose, directly answer your question, I think that is kind of I suppose there's kind of two core kind of political angles that we take in the magazine. One is that this is actually important, all right? That Ireland has changed dramatically, that there is a real possibility of a left-led government after the next election where we will have socialists in ministerial offices, where not diluted with Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, but there'll be an actual left-led government in this country after the next election. And what that looks like matters. And having the ideas going into that government matters. And having the debates on the left about what that could mean matters. So that's one idea that we have. The other idea that we have is that socialist politics matters. So, you said broad left. Actually, we're not broad left. We're broad socialist. If you say you're on the left and you're not a socialist, we won't publish you, basically. That's where we kind of draw the line.
They're all socialists in it, then.
Yeah, I mean, so even, I've known Cian O'Callaghan for a long time, and he's more left-wing than you might think. Right. But yeah, so everybody, it's a socialist magazine. And that's kind of a parameter that we would draw. But again, that reflects also not only in Ireland, but internationally, that there is, I think, a renewal of, after the 1990s, after the defeat of the left in the 80s and 90s, the rise of this kind of neoliberal left of Blairism and so on, that over the last 10 to 15 years, you've seen kind of a re-emergence of socialist politics, whether it's Bernie, Corbyn, the DSA, Mélenchon, and so on, that there is this kind of emergence of actually the ruling class is the problem. And that's something that we need to kind of think about and strategize about, and that it's not enough to kind of just be, things are bad and pointing out that things are bad, that we need to think about, okay, well, actually we should try and get power and change it.
And on that, something that you said there about the complete lack of actual left voices in the mainstream media, we do have one of them here, Jenny Maguire. And in your work with the Irish Independent, I mean, is it fair to say that you're from the far left of the Irish Independent?
I've set up the Irish Independent gulags and they're ready to go. So we're working great.
And yeah, down through the years, growing up, there was always Jean Carrigan on the back page of the Sunday Independent, who always published great left-wing commentary. And I always think of you as working in that same tradition. And some of the columns that you've written, like say for example about the left focusing more on material issues and getting back to real kind of bread and butter stuff, and really enjoyed your column as well about Gerard Hutch's use of AI, but what that means for broader humanity, And what I'd like to know is, when you publish these pieces, are you speaking to the left, or are you speaking to the Irish Independent readership, or is it both, or what do you do?
So I am speaking, by the time I press submit, I'm speaking to my mom, I'm speaking to my nana, and so, my nana who lived in the Ballymount flats when they first went up, and then in Darndale. I'm speaking to the people that I grew up with, because I know that when I go home and I have chats with them, I see barriers that aren't being talked about. So often, even when we talk about from a left media perspective, we make an assumption of what a working class person is, and we construct one. In that, even when we bring it back to bread and butter issues, I think we are still quite naive in. For people who grow up and live in this survival mode, there is still a real fear and a real want for conserving that whatever they have, and to conserve whatever we have. And I think I'm trying to talk to my nana, and then when I press submit, I'm told off and told I need to talk to the Irish Independent readership, which is this magical, mystical person. If anyone comes across them, let me know. I'd love to chat to them.
I think they call it Middle Ireland.
Yeah. And I see article after article that is for Middle Ireland, and then when I take my articles and then I make them into a social media post, and I make them into something more engaging and to reach audiences that the Irish Independent aren't, thinking from a business perspective, God, that's great, fantastic. But then I am constantly being pushed up against when I'm going too far. And it is a constant struggle to justify, when I say any sentence, I'm trying to find any source that says the exact same thing that I can justify myself. Because, of course, I'm coming at it also as a 24-year-old, and I'm coming at it as a woman, and I'm coming at it as a trans woman. And, it is a constant battle of ideology, and I'm told, I've had better editors and good editors and not so good editors, but it is still trying to justify my space within that at every time. And I guess, and I end up having to think about the Middle Ireland person, but I think that is just code for a conservative Ireland. Yeah. And I need you to write a more conservative piece, and I need you to write a piece that is that upholds the status quo. And even outside of just writing, when I've been on the Today Show, it's a nice morning, nice afternoon show, and even if I throw in a little throwaway comment, I feel the blood pressure in the room start to rise, and if you're just oh, maybe landlords shouldn't benefit off our suffering, isn't that right, Dahi? And so it is something that it is a constant struggle, and this naivety, and I think I've accessed a lot of additional spaces because they presume, oh, look at us having a trance. Yeah. Look at us having a trance. And then I go in and they're like, oh, look at us having a trance. And it is because like so often I think, identity politics, I think, has played a part in giving me a platform in sorts, but it is the identity politics that is in part pulling us down, because it has created a structure within our media where we view we view people through the realm of ideas instead of their the actual lived reality and the material reality of them. When I say stuff like, when I'm talking to my nana at home around the kitchen table, that we need to bring it back to bread and butter issues. Her trans grandchild is still her bread and butter issues, and it is about offering a vision of a future that is actually works for her, her daughter, her granddaughter, and that's all.
Nice, yeah. I think all four of you in kind of different ways, but Rory did mention that these ideas about, after you publish in the Irish Times or the Irish Examiner. I mean, I do remember the Irish Times piece, and I remember some of the reaction to it. An academic down in Limerick, say, for example, that whole pro-NATO crowd, et cetera, and I remember that piece and other pieces like it being met with a response of, that this is illegitimate, almost, right? That this isn't even, an idea to be debated in the marketplace and blah, 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 but that it's, just not worthy of discussion, that it should be kept out of the mainstream. It reminds me of, sometimes we talk about with the guys in the ditch where, sometimes we'll give out about not having our stories picked up. Generally speaking, we always come back to saying, like, guys, when we set this up, we kind of said, we're going to publish stories that the mainstream media won't or can. So it's kind of like, is this not what we're trying to do here, right? So my question is to you, like, should we want the ruling class and the people who own the mental means of production, should they consider our views illegitimate? And if so, how do we respond and run with that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess thinking about those columns, the Irish Times and a series of... So the Examiner have been good about publishing a series of columns, op-eds rather than columns, but part of what we're trying to make is arguments about neutrality and where it's in militarization, where they sit in broader economic and geopolitical structures. But the other argument always we have to make, and it's an important one, and it's partly to appeal to the Examiner, the Irish Times, their audience. This is about democracy, like talking about the supposed market of ideas. We don't have a market of ideas because the little gatekeepers are so tight, right? And I think there is, so we often end on this note, particularly the things that myself and Paddy Bresnan have done, and it was like, partly like it's a strategic putting it in there, the ending on, this is a threat to Irish democracy, both the discussion about neutrality and so on, but also the nature of the debate. It's a threat to our democracy. Like, we end up extremely, I think it's Aoife and Oisín have both said this, and what Jenny was talking about bread and butter, they're basically excluding so many of the issues that matter to so many people. So we're trying to think about, like, who is the readership, right? Like, and its audience, like, who is this, like, fantasy middle class person? And again, that is, like, just as Jenny was saying about, like, the kind of idealist version of, like, sets of people in boxes, right? And, of, like, who is our reader? Who do we want to reach? And so I think we shouldn't, this is a debate, like, should we even bother trying to get into the Irish Times? What's the point of doing that? I think there is.
Should we though? Yeah, like, it's a good, yeah.
I think that in that case, you saw from the response, the minister responded, to try and shut it down on the Saturday.
That was Thomas Byrne.
Thomas Byrne tried to shut it down, and then you had, of course, this group of hawks, this kind of ecosystem of, think tanks and academics and arms lobbyists, all of whom use their academic positions either because they are academics or they have some fantasy adjunct research fellow, and they use that to leverage to give themselves this respectability. So, as an academic, someone who works I work in Trinity, it disgusts me that these people leverage their academic position, not just the ones who are academics, but the ones who aren't, like Dan O'Brien, who's not an academic, but he presents himself as an academic, adjunct research fellow. I notice he's speaking in some festival in Drogheda, and they call him Professor Dan O'Brien. Now, I'm sure that Dan O'Brien, in fairness to him, and I don't like to be fair to Dan O'Brien very often, but in fairness to him, I doubt Dan O'Brien said, I am a professor in his bio, but they see him as such a god of, like, common sense that he must be. And Dan O'Brien is an extremist. And he's out there leveraging that academic role whilst making tweets all the time saying that basically social sciences and humanities are woke, training cultural Marxists. This is stuff directly taken from the British, like Tory far right of the Tory party, from the American far right, from European far right, like using that language to denounce academic programs, courses. They don't really name individuals, but they'll attack them. And so, and they're like, I don't know if they're all in back chats, but there's a very concerted effort, not to say it's centralized like a plot, but there's an ecosystem there and they go after it. And so I think them being ruffled shows that, because they become aware, and they don't care about what I say or what Jenny says or Aoife or Oisín say. They do care about the fact that they know that our arguments and positions will resonate with people, right? And of course there is the discussion then about like, well, if they welcome you in, is that being used to kind of co-opt you or dilute it and so on? And I think that's a difficult thing to cast a view on. And I think my position on it would be that we shouldn't focus all our attention on it, but it's a useful lever, and trying to build alternative ecosystems, whether it's the podcast, whether it's on Clogan or other publications, and things like the Whistleblower podcast now, trying to diversify our media a little bit, and then making kind of forays in from the forest, like down into the pale to get into these publications and levers them, and kind of keep the frighteners on them a little bit. But I think if you try to do that, that was all your energy would go into it. There's a serious risk of co-option, and I think they probably want to, they feel a need to have a diversity of opinion to a certain extent, and that's what they want to get out of you. And for example, that Irish Times piece was like we had a word in it, which was that there was a media establishment consensus. And it got to a point where they were basically not going to publish it unless we took the word consensus out. And we had a huge debate about what the word consensus meant. And they read it. They were very, very defensive. And I'm very glad that they did publish it. So not to be like slamming the op-ed editor. But clearly it wasn't just them. They were getting pressure from the discussion. It took, again, a long time. They didn't just agree to it. And they pushed back on that consensus. And it seemed to be that they understood when we said consensus, that either there was 100% agreement amongst the establishment or that it was a centralized plot. And the editor actually said to us, we don't take orders from anyone. The government doesn't tell us what to say. And the head editor of the paper doesn't tell me what to say. And we were like, we never suggested
just
either of
got
those
confirmation
things.
from a government advisor that they
that
didn't tell
didn't
us what to
happen.
say.
But like, that's what they are hearing, about consensus. And you're like, no, there's a spread of opinions, and there's like, there's 4 of them, and you all have them. They're not all the same, but they're all in this angle of the thing, And just the last point to make with that, is maybe not relevant to your question, but something that came up when Aoife was talking about the role of, particularly in the military and neutrality bit, as your media appearance that you mentioned, with this like debate, should say, is like the inverted commas, but the role of the British security apparatus in these debates is unbelievable. And I think that's another thing with like, we can think about think tanks like Progress Ireland in the sphere of industrial development or infrastructure development or housing. These kind of think tanks that represent external actors, and the Collisons are 2 Irish lads, plucky lads that did well.
Just out for jogs in Tel
Just out
Aviv.
for jogs, but they're massively leveraged with tech money from the US internationally, and then you have the British state and RTE particularly. And our Irish Times, there's two articles published last autumn and one this winter. One of them was like, "Stop blaming the Brits," which was a quote. That was the headline, which was from Rear Admiral Chris Parry, former NATO and British naval commander. And another one, I can't remember who it was from, was what was that? There's ridiculous titles, like, they basically saying that Ireland has a kind of post-colonial complex and it needs to get over these things. But using quotes, like kind of almost like trolling quotes from British military figures as the headlines for the Irish Times. And of course it's clickbait. It's like middle class clickbait, and it works. But everyone's into this slightly jokey thing already.
Yeah, and I've often found, just on that point, right, so I've often found, in Brexit, I was at the Examiner during Brexit, so followed Simon Coveney all over Europe, and even when Mary Lou was in New York and they had this flag that said Brits out of Ireland or whatever, and they were all, oh, Jesus, like clutching their parents. And I remember Simon Coveney said once, it was during Brexit when Boris was making balls of everything and the relationship, someone was like, the British and Irish relationship has never been so bad. But also Simon Coveney and Simon Coveney said, You know, it's time that we put this immaturity behind us. This notion that if you learn from colonial mistakes and decide to choose another path, that's immature. To hate the Brits is immature. Now, he wouldn't come to Derry and say it was immature, but it's easy for him to say it in Brussels and it's easy for him to say in Dublin. I don't even think he would have said it in Cork. But I think, you know, this notion that it's like, it's immature to be left wing, and it's also immature to look at the Brits and be like, a lot of the problems that we still have are here because of you. And that is an immaturity. And even that, when you said, should we try and get into the Irish Times? The majority of Irish people agree with you. So it shouldn't be a question of, like, that should be the leading commentary in the newspaper. If we're writing to the audience that we think we have, and we know that all the polls tell us that neutrality, people are in favour of it. But we've gotten to the stage now where the people who have the popular opinion can't get an article published. And then they wonder why we should fight for newspaper journalism when this is the state we've left it in.
Something else about you actually that I did mention in the introduction is that you're also a best-selling author. Your book, The Long Game, about Sinn Féin, and you write about Sinn Féin, and one of your more recent columns was about Mary Lou McDonald and her failure to condemn internment after comments made by Gerard Hutch. And two questions I have is, first of all, how do you approach Sinn Féin from the left, and how do you write about Sinn Féin from the left? Because obviously, you know, all this other stuff that we're talking about, how the Irish Times covers Sinn Féin critically is different to the way you cover them critically. And also, has your work on Sinn Féin changed the that kind of perception of you as a Shinner, basically?
So the Irish Times covers Sinn Féin, that they don't know anything about Sinn Féin. And I cover Sinn Féin because I grew up with Sinn Féin. My dad's a member of Sinn Féin. I grew up in a very Republican state. I walked past an IRA monument to get to school. So I write about Sinn Féin because I know them to their bones. And that's why they were very, very annoyed when the book came out. Because someone said to me once, yeah, it was all right when Shane Ross wrote the book about Mary Lou, because we could turn around and say, well, he's a privately educated former banker. What does he know about Mary Lou McDonald? But they couldn't turn around and say, what does Aoife Moore know about Sinn Féin? And I'd like to point out that I was never sued by Sinn Féin, and kind of stand the journalism. But it is that, you know, if you're not for us, you're against us. And it was made very clear to me that I was against them once the book came out, that I should have known better, should have done better. I was called a pawn for the far right. And I cover Sinn Féin critically because I would love Sinn Féin to be better. I expect nothing from Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, but I expect better from Sinn Féin. I expect it from PPP, I expect it from the Social Democrats. And my point of the column this week was that Sinn Féin are not a left party. If they're going to vote against progressive abortion legislation, they're going to ban trans healthcare. They don't condemn anti-Somalian racism or any other type of racism in Mary Lou's own constituency. And the leader of Sinn Féin had nothing to say about the suggestion of internment. I mean, how anyone can think that they could get voters from Aontú and PBP in the same election just shows you that they are trying and failing to win votes all across the board. And I understood it maybe 10 years ago when the abortion debate was really like taking shape. And the North is different. When everyone says the North, when it comes to abortion, it is different. The likes of some of my aunties are a lot older than my mommy, so some of them be in their 60s and 70s. They stopped voting for Sinn Féin because they're anti-choice. They're very Catholic little old ladies and they're anti-choice. Those votes are never coming back to Sinn Féin. So all my aunties, that vote is not coming back. But Sinn Féin still think if they flip-flop enough on abortion, they might be able to claw some of that back. And I know they're not paying me for my advice, but they should. But that's done. And I think the progressive vote that was lent to Sinn Féin in, say, the last two elections will disappear now because they've banned trans healthcare in the North and they voted against progressive legislation. You can't be all things to all people. And people ask me all the time about the difference between Gerry Adams and Mary Lou, and although there are a lot, this much was never asked of Gerry Adams in a political sense. There is a lot more now that Mary Lou has to deal with, and obviously she gets a harder time because she's a woman. I think nobody would disagree with that. But I have been incredibly disappointed with Sinn Féin, and I feel like every time there's one of these stories, I feel like being like, I told you this in the book. But I think a reckoning will have to come, because they can't flip-flop forever now. The Bows jersey wearing vote isn't going to stay for much longer until they make a decision.
Actually, on Jerry, Oisín very much enjoyed your interview with Jerry, and which was published in Antlogan. And I'm wondering, how do you approach an interview with Jerry Adams, and how do you set about it? Because obviously, you know, there's a clip on YouTube of Jerry on the Late Late being interviewed by Ryan Tubridy. Now he makes a bit of a dick of Ryan Tubridy, actually, where, you know, Ryan Tubridy did the standard kind of thing of, I'm going to ask you about the IRA. Obviously, you were coming at it from a different place. So how do you approach it? What did you want to get out of Jerry?
Yeah, so what I wanted to get out, I mean, how did I approach the interview? I did a lot of reading. And what I wanted to get out of the interview was, you know, if you go back and you read something like Politics of Irish Freedom, which is a book that the book that Adams brought out in the late 80s, and then it was republished a number of times in the 90s. I think the final edition came out in like 96 or something, so not long before the Good Friday Agreement. And in that, the politics in it are very socialist. There's a chapter in it that's very, you know, it is, you know, not to the left of what PPP might say privately, but definitely to the left of what they say publicly, you know. It's a very explicit, we are for seizing control of the means of production, putting them under democratic public control. We want a total transformation in the property relations in Ireland. Now, it poses that in the sense that this would only be possible subsequent to British withdrawal from Ireland. But that's what you know what they're saying very explicitly in this book that I said, I think the last session came out in 96 or so. But you go back and you read things, you know, throughout the 70s and 80s, and there's similar things being published. And obviously, this is not what leading members of Sinn Féin are saying publicly now. They're not coming out saying, we want to socialise the means of production, we want to put them under democratic public control. So the question I wanted to go into the interview was, well, is this something you still believe? What do you think about it? What does it mean today if you do still blah, 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 and to see if, you know, would he say, well, that was a politics that, you know, today isn't really as relevant, and et cetera, or would he say, as he did say, no, I still completely believe all of those things, and the task is still the same, the road is a bit different, but we're still going towards the same thing, which I thought was, you know, I mean, it's kind of disappointing that nobody picked it up, but some of the stuff that he says in the interview is quite, you know, quite remarkable for such a prominent politician in Ireland.
Yeah. So you know, interviewing Jerry Adams for a socialist magazine, it's different to Jenny, the work that you would do, and you kind of mentioned a little bit about you know, how you first write the piece, and then, you know, there is a process with the editorial team, and I'm wondering, do you ever feel a pressure to modify your politics, and how do you deal with that? Yeah,
I mean, I guess it's looking at the piece and reading it as if I was like the opposite of me, and coming at it and then looking at it, and any statement that provokes an emotional reaction in me, I want to have down, and I want to have it fully backed up, and but like, I'm a opinion columnist. I'm someone who should be able to express the opinions and have it fully backed up and believed, instead of me having to fight for every single step along the way. So that something you were saying, Rory, earlier about like whether we should be writing and fighting for mainstream acceptance. I think it really it's a matter of infrastructure, in that like we have lost and we are losing the social media game, and that we no longer have X. We no longer, like, Instagram is not made to fully get ideas out there in the same way. And I think like we are looking at the mainstream media and we're looking for the alternative, but I think like with the likes of The Ditch, with the likes of Aintalk with the likes of different areas that I want to see real infrastructure in, actually giving people and believing writers and believing that that another perspective can exist, because I am there in opposition to the paper. I am there in opposition to the primary focus, and I'm there so that they can publish 3 papers with letters against it after the fact, which they did when I wrote about abortion. And so, like, in a way you are used, and a way you use them, but that is a conversation you must engage with. But I think we need to be looking and putting our energy into something much bigger and into infrastructural changes, because we're losing the information battles. We are trying to talk to people, trying to talk to my other nana, I get the right-wing talking points handed to me.
Yeah.
And they didn't just pull that out of their arse. They pulled it because they saw it on Facebook, or they saw it in different areas. And if we want to talk about information and talking about truth, we are on the back foot, and I think we have to be pushing forward to actually justify our existence and a left-wing perspective in itself, because it is constantly undermined.
Yeah, God, I mean, so much of what you said there, that idea of being used, but also, building alternative infrastructures, I think it's the hardest thing to do, but it's probably the best thing to do for the left. Guys, I'm really glad that I wore linen today.
Yeah.
I'm going to say thank you so much, guys. We had Jenny, Aoife, Rory, and Oisín, just amazing panelists. We've got a nice little day coming up. We've got Ard O'Connor in conversation with Rob Doyle here in about half an hour or so. We've got some chimac on the way. We've got food and drink. Thanks so much for coming.
Woo!